Hi, I'm Brendan Burns from Microsoft Azure, and today I have a special video. I had someone tweet a request to me for information about how to productionize a system, thinking about ingress, securing namespaces, which is a great reminder. If you want to see more, we're going to do more of these videos, and if you want to see more or specific topics covered, please feel free to send me a request. I'm at Brendan D. Burns on Twitter. You can find me on GitHub or anywhere else. Happy to work on things that are interesting to everybody. So the question about productionizing a cluster, productionizing a service is a really interesting one. There's a really wide variety of things that you should be thinking about. So we'll talk about some of the general areas. The first is thinking about your cluster itself. And remembering that your cluster API and the contents of your cluster, the machines in your cluster, are a security boundary for your application. So you want to be thinking about how do you properly secure that cluster. Definitely be thinking about RBAC and the roles of people who have access to that cluster. For example, you may want to differentiate between a developer who has read access and an operator who may have write access. I would think a lot about a CI/CD pipeline that points to your Kubernetes cluster and is the only way that code can be pushed into that cluster. That really ensures that you can put process here for validation, vulnerability detection. And likewise, you should be thinking about running intrusion detection and vulnerability detection on the cluster itself, probably via a daemon set, so that you can find things that are wrong with your cluster. But of course, security is only a part of it. You also want to be thinking about how do you correctly operate that cluster? How do you make sure that the applications you're deploying into Kubernetes are operable? And that's where something like ensuring that you have a good monitoring solution installed on the cluster. Something like the Azure Monitor SaaS solution or an open source Elk stack. These are things, again, you can install directly onto the cluster using a daemon set. And ensure that you have all of these things in place so that when a problem happens, you're not scrambling to figure out how to monitor it. You're scrambling to figure out how to fix it. Likewise, I would think a lot about testing every single process that you have. So if you're going to fail over, obviously you should probably be in more than one region. So if you have a cluster in region 1 and you have a cluster in region 2, and you're going to fail over in the case of a disaster from region 1 to region 2, you should think about how practicing that, making sure you can actually do it, that it's not a theoretical design, but it's actually a practical design that you've practiced. Practice is a big part of being good at operations when you go to production. It's kind of like an emergency room, right? You don't want to be trying something out for the first time when there's a patient there. You want to be doing it ahead of time where you can find all the problems, all the things you didn't anticipate before it's a crisis situation. Speaking of developing reliable applications, it's worth thinking about how are you actually planning on providing for failure and failover. So you want to deliver a worldwide application. You might have myapp.com as a DNS entry. You can use something like Azure Traffic Manager to map it to different IP addresses depending on the geographic area. So GeoIP, this could be 24.1.2.3. This might be 128.7.8.9. And this is going to go to, here, this is your European cluster. Here, this is your US cluster. And this is going to go to, Kubernetes cluster in Europe somewhere. And this is going to go to your Kubernetes cluster in the US. But what happens if, for example, the Kubernetes cluster in the US fails? Well, you're going to need to be able to have appropriate health checks going from the DNS system and your cluster here so that if something bad happens, it will fail traffic over even from the US to your European cluster. Likewise, if you have data stores in here, you need to think about how you're going to be replicating data between these two locations. And this is a place where something like Cosmos DB or some other software as a service data store is going to be a great choice for most people because you don't want to be the one who's managing cross-region replication of data. You simply want to write your application to use that data store and allow it to do the replication for you. So thinking about all of those pieces of how do I secure my cluster, how do I set up the right cluster services, practicing things like failover and making sure you've architected your application for multiple regions and using geographic identity information to achieve low latency. Those are all great things to be thinking about as you go towards production. And also I'd focus a lot on the CI/CD pipeline. Hopefully you set that up already. But if you're still thinking about how to set up CI/CD, we've got a number of other great videos on that.